Hello and welcome back to another episode of Hollywood Wargaming. Today we are diving in once again to our bolt action unit guide and topping off our high explosive weapons by taking a look at mortars and of course starting from the bottom with the light mortar variant. Now, light mortars were often used in squads of infantry in World War II to provide some mobile and light ordnance that could be used to either dislodge enemies from fortifications or provide smoke screening when other army elements like artillery was not available. And that is a pretty general overview, but it definitely pertains to how this weapon was translated over to the rules of bolt action. However, I am going to save smoke and smoke screening for its own video, and we are going to focus solely on the offensive capabilities of the light mortar. Now, the light mortar, when run as its own unit, is going to cost you about 35 points when run as regular, and just 24 points when run as inexperienced, which is potentially a viable strategy considering that this is an indirect fire unit, meaning you're not going to be suffering that -1 to hit from being inexperienced, which is a major drawback on most other traditional small arms units. However, all the other drawbacks of being inexperienced will come into play here as you are a closer ranged weapon, unlike some of the larger mortar options, and just because you are indirect fire does not mean that you can shoot enemies that you can't see. You do still need line of sight, so your opponent will be able to retaliate and put pins onto you, which is not a situation most inexperienced units like to be in. But the light mortar, when run on its own, is going to be a two-man team weapon, with the mortar operator itself and also a loader, which means if you lose that loader, you are going to be suffering a -1 morale penalty and also have to take a morale test for being at half strength. But the traditional -1 to hit for not having a loader will not affect this unit because again we are indirect fire here. But overall, not the most durable unit due to its small squad size, though with just 2 models you are going to get the small team special rule, which means enemies targeting you are going to suffer a -1 to hit, something that is going to go a long way in terms of durability for the squad. But again, this is a shorter range weapon, so I don't think it's going to do as much for you here as it would on something like an AT rifle. So the real key to keeping a light mortar squad alive is going to be putting them in heavy cover or indoors, and do your best to avoid getting charged by larger units who can punch you out in melee. But of course, all mortars are going to be indirect fire weapons, which means you never hit on a standard roll, but instead declare a target within your minimum and maximum range, and roll a d6 to see if you hit them. On your first roll trying to target that unit, you will only score a valid hit on a roll of 6. However, if you miss the unit, you will be zeroing in on them, and next turn, gain a +1 to that hit, which would be hitting on a 5+, and then the following turn on a 4+, and so on until you are at 2+, or inevitably score a hit. And once you do score that hit, whether it be on your first roll, scoring a 6, or a few turns into dialing in on that squad, your mortar team will then count as zeroed, meaning they know the exact location of their target, and will proceed to hit them on a roll of 2+, provided your mortar team or your enemy target has not relocated. So with the concept of indirect fire in mind, mortars really are suited to target stationary enemy units, which makes them a prime counter to enemies in hard cover, as a mortar zeroing in on that squad can either force them to relocate or run the risk of being hit with that high explosive profile, very much on par with their real-life battlefield role. But before we move on to take a look at this weapon's profile, I do want to point out the lack of the fixed keyword here, as the light mortar is an entirely man-portable system, meaning you are just as nimble as a standard infantry unit and can move and fire on an advance order. So when we look at this weapon profile's ranges, we must consider the movement phase also, as that will add 6 inches onto your potential threat range. But with all of that out of the way, we do have our stat line for our light mortar, and as I mentioned earlier, it is going to have a relatively limited range, with a minimum distance of 12 inches and a maximum of 24, meaning you will not be able to engage opponents within 1 foot or 12 inches, and your maximum range is going to be 2 feet or 24 inches, which is on par with the standard rifle, which again is going to put this small unit in harm's way if you want them to see action. Also, it will require the squad to do a lot more moving to get into range, which means less time firing and less time zeroing in on that indirect fire, which means most of the time, light mortars really are just going for that lucky 6 when they're trying to hit a target. In bolt action, you don't really get a whole lot of those naked gun style firefights in which a rifle squad and a light mortar are going to be within 24 inches of each other exchanging blows long enough for that light mortar to zero in. So in that regard, light mortars are used much more aggressively than other mortar platforms, and you won't be doing nearly as much zeroing as you would with those other weapons. But after our range stat here, we are going to see that this is going to be a one-shot weapon, which is pretty standard for something like this in bolt action. and our penetration value is going to be tied to the high explosive value, as HE weapons do not use velocity to penetrate their targets, but instead the payload of their explosive shell, which in this game means they do not lose penetration value over long distance, which on a weapon like this would be your entire firing arc, which isn't the biggest deal for the light mortar, as it does only have a penetration value of 1, but being indirect fire is going to mean that any hits against armored targets are going to count against their top armor, which will confer a +1 penetration value, which means this weapon is capable of penetrating things like tankettes with an armor value of 7, but that definitely is a bit of an uphill battle, and if you are running light mortars, it is probably for anti-personnel use, but if you are desperate, just know that this is a tool you have in your arsenal. And honestly, crazier things have happened in bolt action, so it's definitely worth mentioning. But lastly, we're going to see that the light mortar is a high explosive 1-inch profile, which is the smallest high explosive template on the chart, and usually isn't likely to nab more than 1 or 2 models, perhaps 3 if your opponent is really bunched up. But if they see that light mortar coming within 24-inch range, they're probably going to make sure that's not the case. Still, hitting 2 models with a penetration value of +1, modifying those wound rolls, is still better than a standard rifle shot. So while this may not seem like the most killy high explosive profile, it definitely is a unique tool in your arsenal that again is more deadly than your standard rifle shot, and is an alternative to responding to enemies who may be dug in fortified positions or deep cover. However, as we all know with high explosive weapons, there is another bonus aside from raw damage, and that is additional pins, as the HE 1-inch profile is going to apply D2 pins to your targets, meaning there is a 50-50 chance for them to get a second pin when hit by this attack, which again is a leg up over your standard rifle. And in a game like bolt action that revolves around pinning your opponents, or so they say, putting your opponent's units out of action with pins is usually a lot more viable than outright destroying them, which tends to require a lot more focus and effort, so D2 pins can become very handy. Now, all that being said, it's not exactly the most reliable or significant way to inflict pins on your opponent, so it is best used when focus firing with multiple other activations to pin out a single enemy unit. But lastly, the HE 1-inch profile is going to score D3 hits against targets within buildings, which honestly has a lot better chance of netting you more hits than placing that standard template on the table in which your opponent has control over minimizing your hits. However, with indirect fire, there is a bit of an issue when it comes to targeting buildings that is going to sort of mitigate your chances to actually score that hit. And this is a pretty commonly forgotten rule in the game, but when targeting units in buildings with indirect fire, you do need to roll to see which floor the shell is going to go off on. And how this works is you basically start on the top floor of the building and roll a d6. On a roll of 4+, the shell has gone off on that top floor and may hit any unit that is on it. However, on a roll of 1, 2, or 3, that shell has instead penetrated that floor and is now dropping down to the next one, where you will make the same roll until you hit the bottom floor. So if you are targeting a 2-story building with a mortar, and your target is on the 2nd floor, after a successful hit with your standard zeroing in roll, you will then have to roll a 4+, otherwise your shell is going to drop through the floor and miss your target entirely. And while I suppose this rule is quote-unquote realistic, I do find it to be a bit of unnecessary dice rolling, and it is a pretty harsh drawback to mortars when they are targeting buildings, which is something they should really excel at attacking. And again, for light mortars that don't have as much time to zero in on their targets due to that shorter range, it really is kind of a death knell to using light mortars against buildings, as even if you do roll that lucky 6, there's going to be a 50-50 chance after that you are going to miss anyways, which honestly just kind of sucks, to put it bluntly. So overall, with the light mortar's weapon profile, there is a lot of drawbacks here, and while it is a unit that can be more rewarding than something like a small rifleman squad, it does kind of rely on a lot of luck, and I think there is going to be a lot of matches where your light mortar simply just does nothing, aside from give you an extra cheap order die. And there definitely is something to be said about being able to take a 1-inch high explosive weapon for 35 points, simply to pad out your activations. It's also worth mentioning that mortars do slot into their own category in the reinforced platoon, which means they're not competing with other valuable resources like artillery, which in my opinion is honestly one of their biggest draws. Still, overall, if we are going for cheap activations here, I probably am going to jump on that AT rifle before I go with a light mortar, as I much prefer the reach on that small man team versus something that you have to get danger close with. However, there are other areas in reinforced platoons where light mortars do show up. Notably, units like the Japanese Special Naval Landing Force has access to light mortars in their infantry squads, sort of how you would take an LMG, with one man becoming a mortar operator and the other becoming a loader, which in the case of the SNLFs can be taken up to 3 times, which means that squad is going to have a lot of opportunities to throw around that 1-inch template throughout the course of a match, all backed up by more wounds, mind you. There are also weapons like the French VB launcher, which is basically a light mortar with 18-inch range instead of 24, and even though you can only put one of those in a squad, if you layer it throughout your force, it is a lot of high explosive weaponry, which will be quite effective if the dice favor you. And even in the games where you're not rolling hot, if you're firing 4 light mortars each turn, you are likely going to get some hits in there, and that is definitely a threat your opponent is going to have to consider. And overall, I really do think that is the proper way to run light mortars, more so than as their own unit, as again, the more times you roll those dice, the more times you're likely to get those 6s, and with a larger unit that has more wounds, you will actually be able to last in battles of attrition. So in that naked gunfight scenario I mentioned earlier, where 2 squads are within 24 inches of each other exchanging fire, your light mortars might actually be able to stick around long enough to zero in on that opponent. But let me know what you guys think in the comment section down below. I personally never run light mortars, aside from my VB launchers on my free French, if you would count that. I tend to get really unlucky not only with the hit rolls, but also the D2 pins, which can be pretty demoralizing when it happens back to back to back. But as always, if you guys enjoyed this bolt action unit guide, go ahead and leave a like, consider subscribing to the channel and turning on notifications, as the unit guide is nowhere near finished, and we will cover the other mortar variants in the near future, so make sure you don't miss out on that. But as always, until then, take care.